everyone! Today I thought I'd put together a quick video about a project I'm working on this month. If you follow a lot of costuming channels here on YouTube, then you probably already know that Kiralee and Rebecca are hosting a Halloween challenge. They're calling it Historical Halloween 2020, and the goal is to create outfits based on costume designs from history. So not a 1920s costume, but a costume designed in 1920 that looks like a window. Most participants are making costumes based on Weldon's fancy dress catalogues. As a few of them have already mentioned in their videos, these were published nearly 100 years ago, and unfortunately that does mean that there are some designs included that really should never have been included. So please do be aware of that if you have a look for these online. So this will actually be the first time in years that I make a Halloween costume specifically for Halloween. That's not because I don't like dressing up, because I definitely do, but I do try not to make things that will only be worn once. Luckily, when I was looking through the designs, I came across this one, which is basically just my ideal aesthetic. I mean, it's like history-bounding goals plus cats. But instead of having a whole video of just me talking about it, I decided to show you a bit of my planning process. I did already have a pretty clear idea of what materials and color scheme I wanted when I was putting these pages together. So I started off by drawing a sketch of the design and adding in the colours that I picked. I'll get into more detail once I start actually making everything, but the three main garments are a dress, a skirt, and a cape. With the design complete, I start laying everything out in my notebook. For personal projects, I like to include a small mood board, just to help me keep everything consistent throughout the project. I also left some space open for fabric samples and for notes about the different garments. When I'm happy with the layout, I just glue everything down and add my notes. I'll be adding in the fabric samples later as I start cutting things out. Okay, I do want to talk briefly about the fact that this design was intended as a witch costume, because I do think it's important that we think about the imagery that we use and where it comes from. And the visual associations that we have with witches, broomsticks, cats, cauldrons, they aren't new. They've been around for hundreds of years. Most of them came with the rise of printing, which allowed this idea of what witches looked like to be circulated much more widely than had previously been possible, mainly for the purpose of stopping them. But it generally wasn't actually about magic. It was about women who were too independent, too sexual, or just generally not acting the way that they should. Oops. If you are also in the mood to go down a massive rabbit hole about this, I've been reading this book to learn a bit more about the general origins of the imagery. I will include the full title and the author in the description if you want to have a look. But looking at my chosen design, we do also have some specifics. Of course, there are still the cats and the broom, but the general silhouette and look of the outfit probably isn't what would come to mind if you were to think of something witchy today. It is, however, remarkably similar to other Weldon's fancy dress images depicting the 18th century. Perhaps not the most active century in terms of witch hunts, but essentially I do think what this design is trying to show is a witch in the time of witch hunts. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be making a Salem victim costume. That would be horrible. I touched on this earlier, but my goal with this project is really to make clothes for my own wardrobe, not a costume to be put on once a year. For me, the design encompasses quite a few of the history-bounding projects that I've been planning on making anyway, and the autumnal colour scheme and cats are just everything I aspire to. But I do think the conversation about where imagery comes from is an interesting one to have, especially where it relates to witchy aesthetic, which is why I thought I'd cover it briefly in this video. I think a big part of what draws people to historical costuming and history bounding is this desire to reconnect with past generations and an older way of doing things. And those can be the same things that draw people to witchcraft and magic. So I think it makes a lot of sense that there's an overlap in these communities. And while some of the imagery was initially created to persecute people, I think a lot of people have adopted it now as a way to empower themselves. And why not, if it was based on strong people who didn't conform to society?